Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I've invited back a guest that I first interviewed in 2020 when he was doing research into COVID compliance and looking at the effectiveness of techniques being used by governments to influence our behaviour under COVID. Benjamin van Rooij is a professor of law at Amsterdam University, where amongst other things, he researches how rules influence behaviour. I wanted to get him back onto the show for two reasons. Firstly, because Benjamin's continued his COVID compliance research and has further insights to share. And secondly, because he's co-authored a book called The Behavioural Code, which is due to be published later this year. In that, he and his co-author Adam Fine look at how laws impact behaviour and highlight how many of the traditional approaches that are used either don't work or can in fact be counterproductive. For obvious reasons, I'm fascinated by this from a human risk perspective, because the same principles that apply to the law also apply to regulation and compliance programs within companies. If we want to get the right outcomes, we need to understand how the rules and processes we impose work in practice. It's also highly relevant for all of us as citizens, because when we vote, we're deciding who we want to legislate on our behalf. And if we understand how changes to the laws that our representatives are proposing are likely to work in practice, we'll be better informed about whether they're likely to be able to deliver the kind of society we want. As you know, if you listen to Benjamin's previous appearance on the show, there's a link to that in the show notes. He's entertaining and extremely insightful. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I know you will as well. So whether you're a compliance officer, lawyer, regulator, auditor, or just someone interested in human risk, what you're about to hear are some amazing insights. Please enjoy, as I know you will, my conversation with Professor Benjamin van Rooij on the Behavioural Code. Benjamin, welcome back to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you so much for having me back. It's wonderful to be here.
It's amazing to have you back. And, you know, as before recording, we were reflecting when it was that you were last. It was about a year ago, and COVID had just started out, and you were doing a whole load of research, and I'll point people to that episode in the show notes. But for those people that did hear that, what have you been up to in the meantime?
So we continued with the corona research. So we did multiple waves in the Netherlands and in the US to actually try and understand changes. So when we first talked, we were in the first wave, and we had this massive behavioral change that was going throughout the world, where many countries had instituted all these rules that wanted to change very basic human behavior. And somehow, at the time, in this early period, they mostly did work quite well. But then we wanted to see, okay, what happens in the longer run? So we kept on doing waves. We're actually still doing that. So that's part of what we've been doing. But other things, a lot of my work has been on finishing my new book, which is actually about why people obey rules or break rules.
And that is exactly why I wanted to get you back here, because I am desperate to find out. So just talk us through, you spoke last time about your area of specialism, so we don't need to kind of cover that. But what prompted you to kind of dive in and write a book on this?
So what I saw in the last 20 years since I started to study compliance, regulation and enforcement, increasingly I met people either on the side of practice or law or legal academics who didn't have a clue, in my eyes, about what actually shapes behavior, but who have a massive influence on the systems that we design to shape behavior. So that's the one hand. The other hand, I met a lot of academics who know a lot about details, intimate details on certain theories and certain measurements, but who didn't really communicate that with a larger audience, nor did they try to integrate the knowledge. So you have this very fragmented academic knowledge that's not accessible, it's high jargon, on the one hand. On the other hand, you have practice and also a general audience that doesn't know it. And some of these revolutionary insights about how law shapes behavior or doesn't just get lost. And that means that we design systems and operate systems, the largest systems to change human behavior, not based on any behavioral knowledge. So that's what Adam Fine, my co-author, and I tried to correct.
Wow. I mean, when you put it in those terms, right, that is absolutely outrageous that we've got something that is really well studied on the one hand. I mean, lots more to do, but is well researched. And then on the other hand, you've got people out there in the field doing it with little or no understanding. And so, I mean, that's in many respects, that's quite shocking when you put those terms, because the impact that compliance and laws have on people, this isn't just a sort of casual thing that occasionally impacts you. This is pervasive.
Well, and that's one of the first arguments that the book makes. So the first argument is, look, we've designed these legal systems and they're not just there to deal with disputes and have court cases. No, they're there to keep us safe. And we argue that, look, the law as we have it nowadays is the largest man-made behavioral change system. So it is there, whether it's in traffic. I mean, we're able to go high speeds because people follow certain rules, because they stop at traffic lights. We're able to have industry and not all choke to death because we have environmental law. We can go to work and hope we're safe and our boss doesn't harass us because we have harassment law. So all these rules somehow are made, at least in part, to keep behavior in check. But then we see that these laws are made and operated largely by lawyers who, in their education and their socialization and their everyday work, are not really trained in behavior. And we also see that in political debates about the law, whether law actually is effective in its or can be effective is not really central. So we see there's a disconnect between, on the one hand, these systems and how they're designed, and on the other hand, all this knowledge that's out there.
And have you got a sense of why that is? I mean, that makes you've beautifully dissected it. Go, this is not happening, and it seems strange to me, really, that it hasn't, because presumably the law grew out of a recognition that we needed some form of order to manage human behavior. And yet we've got to a point now where the disconnect between what I presume is the genesis and the reality is quite extreme.
Well, at the end of the book, we make maybe a little bit silly, but I do think it works, a comparison with the medical profession and the legal profession. So if you look at medicine and the science of medicine until the 19th century, for centuries, they just followed age-old practices, was little innovation. And it was really focused on ideas that didn't really work well. So bloodletting and those type of things. It was all about letting an imbalance in the body out. And then in the mid-19th century, we got science. And there was academic knowledge about viruses, about infections. And suddenly there was this whole revolution. But it took a while before medical practice actually started to use this knowledge. And then you got a medical practice that was more based in science. With law, we're still in this sort of age-old tradition of how we do law. It's all focused on understanding rules. It's all focused on trying to understand what these rules mean for disputes. And we very much have a focus on how do we apply rules to behavior in the past, rather than what do rules mean for behavior in the future. So what we see is that the academic knowledge just has never been part of the legal tradition of how we train people. And that, because law is quite traditional, hasn't changed. But the second problem is, once we want to make predictions on how rules shape behavior, it gets complex. We're talking about complex causality. There's many influences on behavior and isolating one from the other. So the science in of itself is very complex and not easy to assess for anyone who wants to. So it's also partly the fault of science that, A, because of the topic it's complex, and B, because they haven't done enough of a job to translate this. So yes, we have books on behavior, Thinking Fast and Slow, popular books, but nobody has taken the effort to kind of make that next translation about, for instance, how does punishment shape behavior? There's no popular science book on this. And what we see is sort of if we have popular books on law, they're all about injustice. They're all about, for instance, for the US, racial discrimination within the criminal justice sphere. They're about how corporations get away with bad things. So they're all talking about things that have happened in the past that are unjust. They're never about how do you prevent injustice. Once they get to that part of the book, they make these big thoughts, these big ideas, but they never base them on empirical reality, whether they actually work and how you can get them to work. And I see most people just think, well, it's just implementation. That's not sexy. It's not interesting. But I think it is. If we don't know how we're supposed to make rules work, we also don't know what are good rules and bad rules.
And so you're really looking at the fundamentals of the justice system and saying, okay, we've designed something that in theory does this. And this, of course, being a very broad church. And that's not working. And so what we want to do is let's dissect the reasons why that might not be working, where there's a disconnect between the desired outcome and the actual outcome. And let's have a look at what might be happening there and what we can do about it.
Yes, exactly. So in the book, we describe that we have this legal code. And we start, the opening scene of the book is, let's imagine you could take a pill, a little bit like the Matrix, and it shows you the world as it really is. But in our world, what you suddenly see is all the legal code. So if you get into your car, and we described this, for instance, somebody living in California, you get into your car, and suddenly you see all the rules that apply to your car. So the California Vehicle Code has 1,000 pages of rules. And suddenly you see snippets of rules everywhere. So we've created this massive system. Even the two of us talking in this way, if you would suddenly see all the rules that apply, for instance, to the screen that you're looking at, and to privacy rules for us talking this way, or to encryption rules, there's so many rules. So on the one hand, we have this legal code that was developed with certain reasons to keep us safe. I mean, there's other reasons as well. Then we describe a second code, and that's the name of the book, the behavioral code. And that's the mechanisms through which actually rules get to shape our behavior. And what we do is we show these different mechanisms as they play out. And we start with those that we know best, which is sort of extrinsic motivations, so punishment and rewards and also tort liability. And then we move to more intrinsic motivations and situational elements. And I can talk more about that later. So we kind of dissect the behavioral code. And we do so on the one hand by distinguishing interventions. So punishment is, for instance, an intervention. And behavioral mechanisms. So punishment can have many different behavioral effects. It can deter us. I mean, so we're scared. But it can also activate or deactivate social norms. It can create more opportunities or less opportunities for crime, etc. So we kind of outline what are the mechanisms that are out there, how do we activate them, and what do we know about how they actually work and whether they actually work and under what conditions they work.
And talk us through that intrinsic piece as well, because I'm fascinated by that.
Okay, let me start though with the punishment, because that's where everybody is. I'm sorry to put it there. So that one of the big findings from, if you look at 30 to 40 years of empirical studies, is punishment doesn't work the way we think it does. So most people intuitively think if there's bad behavior, just have strict punishment, and it's going to be gone. It's very intuitive.
There's the stuff that we read in the Bible, for example,
exactly,
that talks about hellfire and damnation type stuff.
Yes.
Right.
So actually, this is not in the book, but in the earlier version, I traced this idea, and I could find it in different traditions across the globe. So yes, you see it in the Old Testament. You see it in the Quran, which is obviously from one singular tradition. You see it in ancient Greece with Plato and Aristotle, but you also see it in the ancient Hindu and Chinese traditions. So we have ideas that developed separately because there's no connection between these four traditions in the ancient world. We see it coming into the modern world with thinkers like Bentham and Beccaria, where it's all about pain and pleasure, and if we have enough pain, we won't engage in bad behavior. And in the modern world, we see it with thinkers like Nobel Prize winner Becker, who got the Nobel Prize in economics, for translating this into the world of cost and benefits. Problem is, there's no empirical proof for it. So if you look at the empirics of punishment, whether it's capital punishment, whether it's 3 strikes you're out, or really long imprisonment, we don't see that it either has a specific deterrent effect. So that doesn't obviously apply for capital punishment. So the experience of going through punishment, it should in theory make you less inclined to do it again. Because you felt the pain of the punishment, you won't do it again. There's no proof for this. There's also no proof that a stricter punishment, for instance, a capital punishment or strong punishment against violent crime, or even for corporate crime, that it actually is a deterrent so they don't do it again. And in part, that's because it's so hard to establish this. There's so many variables that are at play. But in part, it's also that we see mixed effects. So when you, for instance, put somebody in prison, sure, that might deter them to do it again. It might deter others. At the same time, prison has a criminogenic effect, meaning that you become more criminal because it's sort of a university of crime. There's also a brutalization effect because you're treated so badly in prison. You might actually commit more crime, or you might do a crime not to get into prison. There's also effects such as exclusionary effects. Once you've been an ex-con, it's very hard to find a job, especially in some jurisdictions, etc., etc. So there's a lot of those things at play. The two things we do know. One is certainty of punishment matters more than severity. So we should be investing much more in better detection of illegal behavior than in the actual jails and prisons that we're building. Second thing we know is that perception matters. That you're having a certain level of punishment doesn't mean people actually see it that way. Even compliance managers in companies, there was one study that looked at compliance managers who managed environmental compliance. They didn't have a clue of what the biggest EPA cases in the US were. So they somehow had their own imagination. What this means is that enforcement shouldn't just be about detection and punishment. It should also be about communication. So once you've punished, the job hasn't stopped, then you have to communicate. So that's the punishment piece. Unfortunately, we find similar findings for rewards and for tort liability. So the other extrinsic motivations that we discuss, they don't work as most of us expect. We would think that, okay, if there's high liability, there will be safer behavior. For instance, we looked at all the literature on medical malpractice liability. So doctors being liable for medical malpractice. There's no evidence, empirical evidence, conclusive evidence that stricter liability leads to fewer mistakes and fewer medical errors. Again, it's the similar things. It's hard to prove, etc. But also there's problems there. We found, for instance, in another study that doctors in the US, where there's higher liability, have very poor understanding of what the exact liability is. So the legal liability, the law, which is another finding in the book, most people don't know the law. So this whole idea that if we get the incentives right, then people will do something, well, first people have to know the incentives. And this is like a bombshell under the whole legal thinking. Most people don't know the intricate details of the law. So that's sort of in short, very short, the findings that we have about extrinsic motivations.
Wow. So you're basically saying not only is it badly designed, but even if it were well designed, the implementation of it isn't great either.
Well, for me, the design and the implementation should be seen in tandem. So, when I still did research in China, I would hear a lot of people say, well, we have great environmental laws, but they don't work well in practice. My first question is, what is so great about your environmental law if it doesn't work in practice, right? Is it beautiful to look at? Is it nice to read? No, to me, they're one and the same thing. So you can make the most stringent law that you could ever do that on paper is beautiful, that is completely unworkable, which is then a really bad law. So to us, look, punishment is part of the equation. It's definitely an intervention that should be part of any intervention. But how to do punishment really means that you have to understand the different behavioral effects of punishment. So in one of the papers I wrote, I've outlined, based on everything I've read, that if you start to punish, there's 18 different mechanisms that you activate, at least. And wow. 10 are negative, 8 are positive. So you have to know what you're doing. So to make this in a simple example, let's say you've punished. And afterwards, you're trying to leverage that effect of the punishment, and you're trying to tell the world that you've caught so many people. So let's say you're the DEA, you're in drug enforcement, and you want to show how many people you've caught smuggling drugs. So when you do that, and you have a big message, this year we collected this many kilograms of heroin or this many tons of heroin, and you show that big number, then you're doing two things at the same time. On the good side, you're showing that people get caught, which is a deterrent. Also, it ends impunity, which is very important. You're setting a norm. On the negative side, you're showing it's very common. So you're activating a negative social norm. So it's that balance. And people who understand this are better able to communicate. They're able to have a deterrent message that's not activating a negative social norm. But it requires some knowledge. So that's what we're saying about punishment. It should be better designed so you understand which mechanisms you're activating and not.
And then, so that's the extrinsic piece. Take us on to the intrinsic piece as well. This, wow, I mean, there's so many things you said that I've just kind of blown my mind slightly. But wow, so let's focus on the intrinsic piece.
So the intrinsic piece is the second piece, and don't forget, there's a third piece that everybody forgets, which is the situational piece, which I actually think is the most important, is where we should start.
Let's do that.
So one of the things we also saw very clearly in the corona research, if you look at the most important reason why people do or do not comply with the social distancing rules, is whether they're able to comply with them, whether they can keep away from crowds in their everyday lives, whether they can work from home, things like that. So simply, people are more or less in a situation where they can follow rules or break rules. And this is a fundamental thing that most people forget. Most people think bad behavior, let's deal with the motivations here. Let's get to the extrinsic or the intrinsic motivations. But you don't get to motivations if you don't have a capacity to obey rules or an opportunity to break them. So let's talk about the capacity first. Most people don't know the law. It's not an excuse to break it, but if you don't know the law, how can you follow it? So an example in the book is Sharapova, the famous Russian tennis player. She was caught using a substance that was banned as a performance-enhancing substance, doping. But she says she didn't know. It had only been banned a month before she was caught. She'd been using it for years. It had been allowed for years. And she seriously didn't know. So if you think about that, if you let that sink in, if people don't know what's expected of them, how can they do what we expect them to do? So a first big but that I already mentioned a bit earlier is, are people able to know the law? And if you look at the growth of legal rules, it's massive. If you take any element of the law, tax law, it's many thousands. I think it's about 32,000 pages of tax rules in the US. Even if you take corporate law, so there's, I think, 200,000 rules that US corporations have to comply with, that if they do not, there's criminal sanctions. So sure, you can hire a lawyer to give you advice on this, but just think about, how do you get a lawyer to explain 200,000 rules to you? And how do you then put these 200,000 rules into your organization that people actually understand and know them? And what we get because of this is very complex systems. For instance, we describe one system in the University of California where laboratories in the university, everybody that goes into a lab has to study 4,000 pages of protocols about dangerous substances in the lab. They have to sign that. So what happens, everybody looks at it, like 4,000 pages, they give a signature. Then it's put into a file. What that does is, I don't think it does much in making behavior safer. I think what it probably does from a behavioral point of view is that people think, all right, this is daunting. I'm not able to do any of this. I signed it. Well, probably what it does do is that the organization, University of California, reduces its liability. If things go wrong, they can say, well, we gave them the information. They didn't follow through. It wasn't us. So the first part of this is, are people able to know the law? And our recommendations there is, look, once you make new rules, you have to think about, is this something where we can actually translate this into behavioral instructions? Can people understand it? Before we make too much new law, we have to think whether we can actually translate it down. And that's a big thing. We should also try and make it less complex. I mean, we have so much complex law. It's very hard for average people to follow it unless you have a lawyer the whole time, which is very hard to have. Second part of being able to follow the rules is more practical. For instance, if you look at corporations, if you make rules that ask a lot of them, where they need high technical skills, etc., do they actually have that? So one can talk a lot about that. A third aspect is more socioeconomic. We looked at the relationship between people's broader socioeconomic opportunities and criminal behavior. And it's very clear. Poorer people, people with less schooling, and people with less access to housing are more likely to engage in crime. So if you want to reduce crime, one of the big things you can do is make sure people finish more school, to make sure people have access to housing, and make sure people have a proper income. These are very logical things. They sound soft on crime, What we actually argue, well, this is smart on crime. But there's also more micro things, so very individual things. If there's one theory that explains crime best, it's called the general theory of crime, which doesn't tell you much. But the more people are able to control their impulses, the less likely they're engaging in deviant or illegal conduct. So that opens up a completely different avenue. Some people are less able to control their impulses and are more high risk. Anybody in the age between 16 and 21 till 23, we all know them, is more higher risk. Their prefrontal cortex is not fully online, so they have less self-control. But even after that, you see people who have more or less, and there's actually training and cognitive training one can do there. So one big part of the book is all about this capacity to obey rules.
Again, I'm struck by you. You were talking through, you have to sign a 4,000 page or 4,000 whatever document. That's obvious. There's plenty of scenarios in quote unquote the real world where that happens. We all download apps without reading what we're clicking to say yes to. If you've ever rented a car, you've done that as well, because none of us bothers reading all that stuff because you can't. There's a ton of people standing behind you and you want to get on the road. So it's really interesting. You sort of look at these things and all of the points you're making. If I were to take any other reference point and say, in the real world that we all know and understand, you could kind of go, if I think about it in those terms, this is madness.
Yes. No, it is madness. And it has a logic. There's a logic to the madness, which is liability. It's all ex post. It's all, if at some point there's going to be a dispute, then the app company will have your signature. The rental car company has your signature. Then you sign something. So they're not about making sure you don't, or you do or don't do the things that are in the contract. No, it's all about if things go wrong, then you as an individual don't really have the rights that you think you have. So, but if we look at it from a behavioral point of view, let's say, for instance, a rental car company wants to make sure you drive in a certain way, all right, or that you park in a certain way. Then having you go through all these papers, and where it's somewhere in the middle of there, is not a logical thing. So instead of that, what you need to do is think, okay, what is the behavior we find most important that we think we can influence you through knowledge? I mean, there's some behavior where telling you, for instance, let's say you're addicted to drugs, telling you're not allowed to use drugs is not going to really help. But let's say here with driving a car, let's say you don't know you shouldn't be doing something. So you probably know you shouldn't be speeding or doing really reckless driving. But maybe there's certain things that a rental car company doesn't want you to do that you don't know. So you find those and you only focus on that. At the moment, I'm doing an experiment with a large a company that makes hardware, and they have an anti-bribery policy. And together with a lawyer and a behavioral economist, we're bringing down the anti-bribery policy from 30 legalese pages to 1 page. And we're testing, and we have two 1 pages. One is more with infographics and one is with language. And what we're trying to see is if you bring it down from 30 to 1, what gets lost, what gets added in terms of what people what people then recall, and then also what do we see in terms of behavioral effects. And we're doing that in order to show in practice in the real world how you can have documents like those 30-page, but then bring them down to shorter documents. Because I think that's where the gain is. The danger is that lawyers will say, well, if we have the 1-page document, what happens to our liability? And that is the big question. And then we as society should ask, well, do we care that much about liability? Shouldn't we care much more about preventing liability?
And I always find that interesting because it's a little bit like, companies making people do mandatory training or signing attestations, along the lines you've outlined. There's always that sort of, well, we're looking at the thing we're trying to prevent. So the courtroom scenario looks better. But actually what you're not looking at is what is the impact on the vast majority of employees that aren't going to ever end up in court. And it's not just, I would say, it's not just around their propensity to comply or understand the rules. It's also, you can actually piss them off.
Yes.
You made me sign all this stuff. You sent a signal you don't trust me.
Yes.
So it's not just that topic. There's a ton of other things where you go, well, if you're going to behave like that, I'll respond in kind.
Yes. And there's research on ethical climate that shows a more instrumental and legalese climate makes people more deviant in an organization. So actually, I mean, this is a different part of the book, but so yes, it can be counterproductive, and that's the argument we're making with the current way of thinking, which is very much on sort of seeing humans as robots that we can program with lines and lines and lines of legal code. And there's a danger there that it actually not only doesn't work, it might actually have a negative effect. That's also why the subtitle of the book is How the Law Makes Us Better, ... or worse. So that's the capacity part. The other big situational part, which I think is much sexier, is the opportunity to break the law. So that chapter is called Speed Bumps for Terrorists. And we start with the liquid bomb plot. So that's the plot where a couple of guys in London had this big plan to blow up all these planes. And they had
This is the one that forced us to put all our liquids in bags.
Exactly. So we describe that to show how these people had this innovative idea, if we can call any form of terrorism innovation, to make smaller explosives. You smuggle them on board in these water bottles. They actually tested this out. They had these Lucozade bottles, I think, with a colorful liquid. And they also had cameras, and the cameras were the explosive device. And then they could put they were the trigger, and they could use the camera with the bottle. So what happened is Scotland Yard and the British services, they found out about this plot. And then they looked at, okay, how do we prevent this? Rather than say, okay, we're going to have higher punishment or new rules for terrorists. I mean, it's very hard to deter a suicide bomber. They did something different, which is what we normally do with suicide bombers. They looked at what is this new way that they're doing and how can we make it harder or impossible? So they kind of looked at the chain of how does the bad behavior work and which chink in the chain can we take out? So that way of thinking is behind the opportunity thinking in criminology. So it's this whole, it asks us different questions. It doesn't ask why people do things. No, we have to ask how they do things. And once you understand the how, then you can have an intervention on making it harder. And we have all these fun examples. For instance, beer fights in pubs in the UK. There was often more damage because people would use broken glass. So they invented new glasses in pubs in the UK, pint glasses that are harder to break. And they even invented ones that weren't plastic, because obviously plastic is now fun to drink from. So it's those type of interventions. Or we can look at money laundering. We've gotten rid of the $1,000 banknote that used to exist. We just got rid of the 500 and I think also the 200 euro banknote. So it's because the weight of smuggling money is much higher if you have to smuggle with $100 bills or with 50 euro bills. So it's very specific interventions that one can think of there.
And I love that, because as you say, it is kind of sexy and fun.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be making light of these things, obviously, but it's kind of entertaining because you sit there and go, okay, that's really clever. And that's kind of that's sort of how I would like to think that the police force and the authorities operate, right? Yes. Which is to sort of go, let's catch this, because that's preventative. Yes. And that's the bit I like about this, as opposed to, well, let's put ourselves in a stronger position when we go to court with these people. Yes. Let's just stop it from happening in the first place.
I mean, there is a downside to it. So first of all, before I get to the downside, I mean, we argue you should always start here. So the first thing you should do is understand the behavior and the variation in it. So you can't have the same intervention for a passion murder and a mob hit killing, even though legally they're the same or sort of the same. I mean, they're completely different in how they operate behaviorally, etc. So you have to understand the behavioral problem first, and you have to outline what is the variation and kind of split it up. Once you've done that, you then have to ask yourself, how does the behavior occur and how can we make it harder? Because if you can, that's where you want to start. You don't want to get to motivation if you can keep people from having a choice. But then we also get to the flip side of it. Any opportunity approach where you reduce opportunities for bad behavior comes at the cost of reducing freedom, because you reduce the cost to people. So, of course, in a book like Nudge, they discuss this, but we go quite further than that, because the kind of things we're talking about are way more than nudges. I mean, some of these opportunity approaches that have happened with crime, I mean, it's not as if this "you can't bring liquids onto a plane" is a nudge. It's just a no. So to give a good example of this, we have instituted all these systems for distracted driving on roads. So, for instance, in the Netherlands, the police was very proud. They have these big touring buses where they put police on top. They're driving on the highway and they're keeping in check from a high vantage point. They're looking at whether people are using their phones. So they were like, "Well, great, higher certainty, higher deterrence." Australia, even prouder. They have these AI systems where they have cameras on top of the road that can actually automatically look into cars and see whether you're using your phone, and you're going to get an automated fine. Great. Except that we found in our research that actually it's quite easy and technological possible to disable a phone while it's being used in the driver's seat. So I don't know if you've ever used Spotify in your car. So if you have Spotify on your phone, if you have it in your car, suddenly it switches to car mode. So it's less distracted. There's no functionality. So the phone knows it's in a car. And it is able to switch into a different mode. Actually, Apple in 2016, there was a court case against Apple by a family of somebody who had been killed by a distracted driver, who found that Apple had filed a patent for this exact technology. And it actually argued in the patent application that the technology in the phone, where it can know it's driving, can be used to prevent accidents. The problem is the phone doesn't have this as a default system. So it's very easy if companies probably have to be forced to do so by regulators, would say that phones in cars in the driver's seat should automatically switch to a safe mode. Even worse, we found there's a company that has developed this $125 thing you can plug into your cigarette lighter, and it'll disable any functionality of your phone while it's in the driver's seat place in your car. So we have these technologies, but we don't use them. And why is that? And here we go back to the political question here. People don't like being curtailed in their freedom. So we go even back to 1973. At the time, the U.S. Highway Authority made this new rule. One rule was every car should have seatbelts. So from that moment on, every car had seatbelts. But it also made another rule, which was that there should be an ignition lock, that you can't start your car unless you're clicked in. There was a public outrage. People felt, look, I don't want the government to tell me whether I use my seatbelt or not. Before, people didn't use seatbelts. And it was such an outrage that the U.S. legislator adopted U.S. legislation forbidding the highway authorities to ever make a rule mandating that people click their seatbelts through these sort of practical systems like an ignition lock. So based on that, the book, we do say, look, there is a downside. It is a lack of freedom. But we also say, look, what do you want? You have a choice here. I mean, political choice. Yes, you might lose the freedom, for instance, to use your phone in the car in a certain place. That's one side. Or you still have the freedom, but then we get these AI systems and we get the government checking on us, which is a different loss of freedom. And we get this sort of deterrent model. So I do think there's different choices there, and we leave that to the reader.
Wow. I mean, it's just fascinating stuff. And as you say, it's really easy to come to a sort of determine, well, this is how we should do it. And then you start to unpick, what does that actually mean? Yeah. And I think it's fascinating in the context of some of the COVID stuff you've been looking at, which is we suddenly had huge, depending on your perspective, huge infringements of civil liberties, or actually we're all doing something community-minded to stop the spread of the disease. And you get those polarized viewpoints. Yes. So I know a lot of your research is looking at COVID for precisely this reason. Yep. But it's fascinatingly timely, and it plays into exactly that dynamic.
Yes, and one of the things we see with COVID studies, if you look at the majority of the behavioral studies of COVID, they're all motivational. And people are just not looking at the situational aspect. And if you look at what really has been at play, it has been mostly situational. The most effectful things have been, keeping people inside through a lockdown, through a forced lockdown where you're telling them you can't go outside. Of course, then they don't need to make the everyday choice. Am I getting close to others, or you take the choice away. And obviously, that's not something that's easy to do or something we should do lightly. But I do see that on the academic side of this, because people are in such fragmented fields, they don't look at the full behavioral code. And that's something our book does do and bring together that we haven't seen other people doing.
So you've done the situational piece. Now talk us through the intrinsic piece.
Yes. So the intrinsic piece has 3 chapters. One is the moral piece. So do you agree with the rules or not, morally? And obviously, the more you agree with rules, the more you're going to comply with them. So that's a very obvious thing where we see a change in history. So if you look at, let's say, law until the 19th century, it largely codified what people thought were the right things to do. So you largely had basic criminal law. Well, most of the basic criminal law goes back to the 10 Commandments in one way or the other. And most people agree with it. So it's much easier than to say, okay, it's a small majority that's actually going against what the normal morals are. But we've increasingly started to try and engineer behavior through law, where maybe we don't really have the morality backing that. So it's sort of a warning towards lawmakers or anybody who makes rules, is to make sure that you understand the sort of moral underpinning of your rules, that you try and persuade people, and that you also understand how uphill the battle is going to be if you're going to fundamentally try and change behavior. Obviously, a poster child here is the US prohibition of alcohol. That didn't really work out. We see similar things with certain drugs, which have been very hard to implement and actually have led to a massive inflation in attempts at law enforcement and creating more markets, actually more profitable markets for the goods that we've tried to ban. So it can lead to conversations about what should we regulate and what shouldn't we. So I think that's one piece there. Another piece is how we show sort of how moral reasoning works. And we show that original ideas where we sort of we're all sort of amateur philosophers, where we all go through these moral dilemmas. That original thinking has been empirically proven to be not so much in place. Much of our moral reasoning is intuitive and automated. And the whole field of behavioral ethics, which we discussed, but there's other work on this, like Yuval Feldman's book, and Yuval's been on your show, I think, but also Max Bezemann and Anton Brunzel's book, Blind Spots. Blind Spots is a very good, popular book into this. And so we go into it and we show, as they do, that people think they're way more moral and ethical than they are at the moment. And the recollection of their behavior is way more favorable than they think. And people are not aware when they are engaged in unethical conduct. So we look at those things, but then we go a step further. We also look at bad people. So we start, for instance, with Joaquim Guzman, the Mexican cartel lord, who I forgot his surname, his nickname. He has a famous nickname. Well, anyway, he's one of those big kingpins in the Mexican drug trade, who was arrested twice and escaped twice, and has just been sentenced in the U.S. If you look at the kind of things he's done, it's really, really evil, the way he's tortured people, the way he's had people killed. So you kind of have to wonder, okay, what makes some people really do horrible things? And are there personality traits that make some people more likely to break rules than others? So we look into the sort of psychiatry and psychology of this, and we see there's certain traits, there's certain psychiatric disorders, certain personality disorders people have, not all, but some make people more likely to engage in deviant behavior, and there's certain personality traits. At the same time, we show that this is not a fully predictive thing. So we show one example of a neuroscientist at the University of California, Irvine, who was looking at brain scans of his own family, and he's an expert in Alzheimer's, but also in psychopathy. And he saw these brain scans from his family, and he saw, this is a psychopathic brain. And then he looked at whose brain it was his own. Right. And he kind of thought, wow, I don't think I've ever killed somebody or wanted to hurt somebody. So we use it as an example that there can be people who have every bit of what would be seen as a disorder, but might actually not be deviant or function in a deviant way. And we also show, which is kind of unexpected, that there's a lot of therapies that work quite well to people who have disorders to keep them from deviant behavior or criminal behavior. So in that sense, the first piece is really on the moral side. Even people who seem to have traits that might make them more immoral can still be helped. So that's the first piece. The second piece is social. So we're very social animals, and a lot of what we do isn't individual choice. It's not just an amoral, rational choice, but it's also not just an individual choice. So we show all the research on social norms, and I'm pretty sure that's been discussed in your show before. Mm-hmm. We respond to others, we respond to bad behavior of others, we respond to positive behavior of others. What we show is that the law sometimes gets this completely wrong and actually makes it worse. So that's the second piece. And the third piece is about legitimacy. So we show that it's called civil obedience. It's sort of the flip side of civil disobedience. We follow rules because we think that's the right thing to do. It's what we should be doing as citizens, regardless of whether we agree with the rules and regardless of whether other people follow it, regardless of whether they're enforced. It's the best situation you can have. You make a new rule, and people learn of it, and they'll follow it. This is the basic rule of law at an individual level. And we show how that originates in legitimacy. So do you think the system is generally legitimate? And we show through all the work of people like Tom Tyler and everybody that follows that this all relates to procedural justice. And then we have this whole larger debate what this means for law enforcement and how we can have a win-win situation here with fairer law enforcement and less crime. But that in practice, we actually see the opposite happening, where despite all these instances of unfair law enforcement, we haven't been able to really make this win-win situation work.
And just talk me through that piece around the law gets the social norm bit wrong.
Yep. So in part what happens is that by instituting an extrinsic motivation, sometimes we're crowding out the intrinsic social motivation. So the most famous study here is the study of daycare centers in Israel, where they instituted a fine, and parents started to come even later. And they were following their own morals and a social norm as well that others were doing. But once they were fined, they saw it, okay, we have to pay for this, now we can do it. So that's a good starting point to get to this. So it means that if the law is not aware of what social norms are at play, both positive and negative, it may inadvertently trigger negative social norms, as I said in the example earlier, where you're showing all these drugs that you caught. You might be showing it's actually normal, or it may be eroding positive social norms. But there's something worse at play, and there's less evidence for this, so we didn't put it in the book in the final version. But I do think there's some indication of this. There have been studies of the so-called reversal effects of prohibition signs. So psychologists in the Netherlands looked at what happens if we put a prohibition sign in an environment. So, for instance, you're not allowed to litter on the floor. If we put that sign, a sign that you shouldn't litter, in an environment where everybody's littering, are people going to litter less, more, or the same as in the same environment where we don't put a litter sign? So what do you think?
Well, I'm guessing if there's a sign up telling you can't do something and there's signs that people aren't, my gut reaction would be you've made it worse.
Why?
Because you've demonstrated that there's no respect for the sign.
Exactly.
So we've got permission to break the law.
Yes, exactly. And that's exactly it. So I actually did the same question with my students. I asked them, what do you think? And most people actually think, well, having a sign at least helps. And what it does, it shows not only that the sign is not respected and maybe that there's limited enforcement, but it also shows that the system as a whole. So they also did follow-up studies where they looked at so-called contagion effects. So you have a sign that's broken, and then you look at, are people also going to break other rules? So for instance, they had, one of the studies they did was they had an old-fashioned post box where you mail a letter, and they had an envelope sticking out with a €5 note. You could see through the envelope there was a €5 note in it. So the test was, are you going to push it in so that it's posted, or are you going to steal it? And that's theft. And then they compared the post box having a graffiti on it or not. And they found in the graffiti situation where clearly a norm was violated, that had a contagion effect, so people were also more likely to steal. And if you think what this means, so this is all very abstract psychology, it's sort of artificial experiments, even though there were field experiments. It means every time we say, oh, but this is the law, in an environment where everybody's breaking it, we might be undermining our own authority of the law. And think of this, we all do this. I mean, even in parenting, I keep telling my kids every day, this is the rule, don't hit your sister or don't tease your sister. But he keeps doing it, right? So what am I doing? I'm undermining my own authority. And that also happens when we have most public advertising on law, or even a lot of law enforcement. We keep on explaining the rules. If we do that in environments where they're widely broken, we might actually be triggering an undermining effect. So that's one element there that actually we didn't put in the book, because one of the principles we used in writing this book, even though it's a popular book, is we wanted solid science in there. So we really went way out to look at, okay, what is the state of science through existing reviews? So not just our own thought on reading 2 or 3 cool studies. And that's the problem with most popular books on this. They have really cool exemplary studies that A, don't replicate well, or don't really are from a body of knowledge. And B, if we're not satisfied with the body of knowledge, we say so. So we've said for some of the studies, we've said, look, we're not sure that this is solid yet. It's too new, it's not replicated, or there's been mixed findings. On one hand, they show A, on the other hand, show B. And that's an important principle for us. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense to write the book, because then maybe we reach a broad audience, but not with the actual science.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible and a fascinating read. So many things to talk about. One, I can't wait to read it, because it's just like there's so many things in there that sort of have me nodding and going, really? You know, I just wanted to. But my question is, so you've written this. What is your hope that, I guess, one who do you want to read this, and 2, what is your hope that they do with it?
So we have different audiences with it. In the end, the only reason that we went this route, and I have to say this is a much harder route than doing an academic book, not only for the writing, but also getting a publisher. You need an agent. You need to convince a publisher through the agent that they're going to be able to sell it. So yes, it's a general public. The general public that likes to read books. So of course, it's not everybody. Otherwise, we should have just made a podcast, which is much more popular. So it's a general audience. What do we hope a general audience does with it? Become more informed of the most important system that is affecting their lives, and make more informed choices and discussions about that system, either when they're making political choices in the ballot box, or when they're responding in different areas at work, at home, with family, with friends, to talk about these things. It is about all of us. So that's the big audience. We hope to reach it through the book, but then also through writing op-eds. For instance, Adam and I, and Adam, by the way, teaches at Arizona State University in the crim department. Adam and I have, for instance, written an op-ed in The Hill, a U.S. newspaper, which is called "How to Have Less Punishment and Less Crime," which we did in the whole defund the police debates, where we kind of try to have our voice there, not saying that we should defund the police, but rather the smarter ways of doing all these things. Second audience is, we do hope that the book is also used in teaching in higher education, especially in law schools. I mean, if we're going to train people, these future masters of the system, we have to change the way they think. I work, unfortunately, in a university where we've made a course in law and human behavior compulsory for all first-year students. So I have 1,000 students each year that I can teach in this. But I hope more law schools make this more central. But also outside of law, political science, even in social science, I don't think that the legal part is central enough. Finally, we do hope policymakers people in practice also engage with this book. It's a one-stop fun read for them to sort of, I've seen many practitioners who've read Blind Spots or who've read Nudge. We hope they read this. I think compared to those books, our book is more also about really bad behavior, not just the average sort of, oh, everybody's good, but they sometimes do things that aren't that good. No, we also talk about real crime. Second, I think most of those books don't really engage with the full social science here. So we bring in a lot of criminology, we bring in a lot of aspects of psychology that some of these books don't really touch on.
Wow. And I think this is going to be absolute compulsory reading for people in compliance and risk and ethics and all those sort of related to HR as well. Let's throw in every function we can that has a human component. But I think it's really interesting because you can have discussions with people about things and they kind of know that it's not doing what it should be doing in the same way that we observe the law. Yeah. But actually in an organization, you have in theory, ignore whether you think a regulator is forcing you to go down a particular route. I question that often, but there will be situations where regulators have that. But there's a real thing. I think this is really helpful because this unlocks something, which is kind of like, okay, your gut instinct is probably telling you it's not as effective as it could be, right? Because you'll know, because you're subject to the rules yourself. And what I love about the idea of what you've just done here is here's a little bit of evidence to support your thinking.
Yes,
right.
Exactly.
Not to say here's a checklist, right? That just because it works in this context, that it's going to work in yours, right?
No.
That's a really dangerous conclusion to draw.
Exactly.
But I think there's something really interesting, a little bit of food for thought of going, maybe I can be thinking about some of these other factors as I design control frameworks and as I think about it. That might give me a better chance to change stuff in my organization because I've then got some academic support behind it.
Yes.
And I can go, so I'm not having to, and the bit I love about it is when you tell these stories, is the car rental one's a really good one, right? We all intuitively know this stuff. And what I like is you've taken those things and then taken a little bit further into a space where people can go, okay, right, so I can play with something intuitively that feels this, that quite hard to question it. Here's a little bit more weight. That puts me in a stronger position to start to challenge this and potentially think differently. Yes.
So the next time you're in that meeting where another whole bucket load of rules are introduced into your organization. And I've been there. I'm one of the people doing that. I still do it.
But that was going to be my next question.
No, I still do it to this day. And I still try and fight it with myself and other people in my organization. So yes, our book helps with that. We have a list of questions in the end that you can ask for any of these situations. Not prescriptions, just trying to get people to open their mind and think systematically through behavioral problems, rather than start with sort of a tunnel vision towards the intervention that you want, for whatever reason. You start with, okay, let's understand the problem and try and see which root causes we can best address. We actually have a separate chapter that really is about organizations. So most of what I just said is individual. So we have a chapter, it's called Eating Systems for Breakfast. And that chapter is all about compliance management. It's all about how it's grown, how we've created these massive paper systems, and what we actually do and don't know about how they work. And most of the evidence is, well, they don't really work well. Most of it doesn't work, and they largely only work where we don't need them. So my conclusion is they work when there's good external oversight, when there's good internal culture, and when there's good leadership internally. Well, you don't need them then. Sure, it's nice to have something extra, but that's not the big game changer where we're looking for. We also looked at whistleblowers, and it's the same. It works from a higher employee to a lower employee in a company. It doesn't work the other way around where you need it. And we find that the biggest undermining thing of these systems is culture. And that's also in the end where you get to. And this is a big part of my other big research. I'm working on developing an early warning system for toxic culture in organizations. Which is separate from this book. It's the next project. And we kind of outline what is organizational culture, what makes it go bad. And we do so by discussing this based on insights from anthropology. But also we've done an in-depth sort of example of what has gone wrong in BP, in Volkswagen with the emission cheating scandal, and in Wells Fargo. And we kind of showcase what a sort of deeper organizational analysis would look like when you're looking at culture. Unfortunately, the news we have is not that good. Once you have a bad culture, I don't know much in academia or even in practice on how to change it. So my main concern there is prevention, making sure it doesn't really grow into a negative culture. But anyway, so the book is definitely also on those people. What you said about intuition is interesting. Intuition plays a large role in the book. You're right that we have intuitions that are in line with findings in the book. However, and this is a big problem, we also as humans have intuitions that are not in line with the book. So like the whole behavioral economics has shown that people are not really good intuitively at statistics. A different line of my research argues that humans are not really good intuitively at behavior. So let's say punishment. We all have that intuition that it works. Yet we can't really see that back in the empirics, and the way we think it works also isn't the way it mostly works. So we take the reader in the book and to have the reader face their own intuition about this, including our own. So for instance, if you are a progressive like me, and I come out in the book saying that I morally don't really like capital punishment. When I then read all the empirics about capital punishment, my brain automatically, every time I find a study that says it doesn't work, I'm not questioning it. It goes in, it finds fertile ground. Anytime I find somebody like Ehrlich in 1973 finding that it does work, it does deter, I'm like, that can't be true. So I start questioning it. And it's the same on the other way around with progressives, for instance, on corporate punishment. Anytime I find a study that works, I'm like, yay, I don't mind that. So we have a moral coherence, as psychologists call it, where what we think is morally right or wrong shapes whether we accept the empirical evidence about whether it works. And we all have that. And that's something to become aware of, to sort of check yourself when you're arguing for certain interventions. Is that because I just like that intervention? Or is it because I actually think it works? And the bad news is, for punishment, there's evidence that our brain makes us happier if we're punishing others. So we're actually hardwired towards punishment. And I'm not against punishment. I mean, it may seem from everything I said, I just want smarter punishments, because I don't think it makes much sense to have all these systems if they don't work.
I love that. That's a great final quote. And I think that is the genesis. And that's why I love talking to you, because I think your research is kind of probing around these conventional wisdoms. And as you say, and as you've been thinking about, really important things that govern a whole ton of stuff that we can and can't do and how we live our lives. And so I think it's, it's fascinating. You sort of, it's kind of inspired me to question something. Now, I think it's great though, but it's a really important debate, because we often these things, we either have a polarized situation, or we're not thinking about some of these dynamics that you talked about, some of the sort of the underlying pieces, and how could we get cleverer and smarter. And actually, I love that the title of that op-ed and the way you reflected that. I think that's really interesting, because actually, nobody wants to have masses of murder going on. No. And so we end up in a polarized situation where we agree fundamentally murder is a bad thing.
Yes.
And yet we get polarized around the death penalty yes no thing.
Yes.
Well, let's just take that off the table and have a think about maybe there's alternative paths, so we don't have to have these polarizing discussions, because we can agree on something that is that neither of us have thought of before. So it's a nice compromise way of looking at stuff.
And that's what irritates me so much about debates about law and criminal justice. They're always about justice, where we get really polarized, because what one person sees as justice, the other person doesn't. And there's so little about prevention of injustice. And it's much easier, I think, for the things we all agree on, let's say pollution, let's say sexual harassment, to really ask those questions and how do you prevent it? And the problem is, people seem to have gotten so far into stakes and identities related to certain interventions that they don't want to objectively talk about, well, do these interventions actually work or not? I think that's probably also something in the corporate world, where certain packages are sold and people have bought onto them. And there's whole schools of, well, we do this and not that, rather than just, and same in academia. I mean, there's whole schools of thought. I'm a deterrence scholar or not. And it doesn't make sense. I just wish we could say, okay, here's a problem. Let's find the root causes and let's see what the cost benefit is in addressing these root causes through different mechanisms. And let's look at it holistically. And I guess that needs changes. So at the end of the book, we argue for changes in law, how we do law, how we practice it, academia. So get rid of these big silos that we have. Let's collaborate and let's communicate better. I mean, you've seen this in the podcast. Not everybody communicates. I think we should all learn that. And third, in society and in politics. And that means the last bit, and it's the last thing I'll say about it, it means questioning ourselves. So as I've questioned myself in reading, in observing how I was going through the science and critically assessing myself in the biases that I have as a human, that is something that we have to learn to do. And I think through that, we may be able to get these less polarized conversations.
That's a beautiful positive thought to end on. The other thought I had was you've potentially caused a real danger for yourself with your kids, so you need to keep them away from the book for a few years so they don't get some ideas about your regimes. But other than that, I think everybody else clearly should be reading this book. So remind us what it's called and where it's available.
So it's called The Behavioural Code. It's published by Beacon Press, and it's going to be on the market October, I think, 21st. I can send you a link. There already is a website on Amazon. It's also distributed through Penguin Random House, so they also have a website there. Anybody with an interest can contact me. I'm happy to talk more about it.
Fantastic. Listen, thank you for the work that you do, because I think it's brilliant, and I'm so pleased you're doing it in such a kind of engaged manner. And thank you for writing a book for the rest of us, because I've got time to read and plow through academic papers, but I know loads of people that will benefit from it don't have. And I love the fact that you've gone to that stage and written something that is designed for everybody. So this will come. I haven't seen it yet, but I know from the conversation we've had, highly, highly recommended. So Benjamin, thank you for all of that. And thank you above all for coming onto the podcast again.
Well, thank you so much for having me again. This was fun. And I'll make sure you'll get the book as well.
Amazing. Thank you. So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Benjamin for appearing again, and to you for listening. To find out more about Benjamin, his research, and the Behavioural Code that's published later this year, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. There's also a link to his previous appearance on this show. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major platforms. If you have yet to leave a 5-star review for it, please do so. It really does help promote the show. If you're interested in finding out more about human risk, including the newsletter and other content that can help you understand it better, visit human-risk.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the show, but in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.